Yeah, it does.
Welcome to today's Economy Committee meeting. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Economy for this meeting. Please may I remind everyone to switch phones to silent mode and ask the members and guests to ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. We've only got the one guest today, so. Today our main item of business is a discussion on financial security and employment opportunities for older Londoners. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask the committee clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Krupesh Harani and Assembly Member Zach Polansky is online. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out on item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? No, brilliant. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings? Noted. Brilliant. Thank you. We now move on to our main item of business. The discussion with invited guests on financial security and employment opportunities for older Londoners. After the first set of questions, we will have a short adjournment for about 5 minutes before going on to the next part of the meeting. And I'd like to welcome our guests. Now, so far, we have... Brilliant. We have all of them. Excellent. Thank you so much, Tim, for making the effort to come in today to City Hall. Tim Whitaker, Trustee of Wise Age. And joining us virtually is Abigail Wood, Chief Executive Officer for Age UK London. Theo Blackwell, MBE, Chief Digital Officer for the GLA. Sonia Khan, Head of Policy and Strategic Delivery, Chief Executives Directorate and from London Borough of Hackney. And Luke Price, the Senior Research and Policy Manager from the Centre for Ageing Better. Now, the committee did actually invite Jules Pipe, the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, to the meeting. We only heard from him yesterday that he was not able to make the meeting, and I will be writing to the Deputy Mayor expressing my disappointment for the fact that he's not here and the lack of, I think, timing was maybe could have been better in terms of letting us know about his apologies. I mean, deputy mayors are crucial for our job in terms of scrutinising the Mayor of London, and we are the voice of London, and it's important that all deputy mayors can make the effort to be here. So you will be expecting a letter from the Chair of Economy, Jules Pipe, and I hope we'll hear a response from you shortly. And now we're going to be starting off with our first question, which is going to go to Abigail, Tim and Luke. We'll start with we'll start with Tim, if that's okay with you, and then we'll go to Abigail and then Luke. And it's a question for all of you. Why have poverty rates amongst older Londoners increased in the last decade, and are there disproportionate impacts on any demographic within this age group? And I'm thinking of ethnic minority groups, women, people who may have a disability. So could you tell us a little bit about what you think the reasons are?
I think the big issue is the kind of structural factors. Sorry, don't forget to turn on my that lie behind poverty rates. So obviously there are issues around ethnicity, there's issues around gender, and I think the big problem is really the extent to which that level of poverty kind of takes us forward into sort of over a period of time, and the risks for poverty then get continued. So it is about absence of good work. It's about traditional poverty issues. It's about the extent to which people can get out of poverty. It's about unemployment. It's about, I think, for older people, it's very much about the fact that if you've been in poverty, you tend to sort of continue through, and that's correlated by very low incomes in jobs that you have. An absence of pensions and all of that. So it's interesting that London is high, and that's probably something to do with the wide range of incomes and wealth within London, I would suggest.
Abigail.
One of the things I'd like to mention is there was a small fall in poverty rates.
Abigail, there seems to be a problem with your sound. Just hold on a moment. Do you want to try again, Abigail?
Is that better?
No, so you're not on mute, so I can't see.
No.
Oh, it's working. Fantastic. Carry on.
Sorry, I think I've got a very old.
Not your fault, I'm sure.
Tech problems. Yes, I want to begin by mentioning there was a small fall in poverty rates for Londoners over the age of 50 around 10 years ago. So we saw it was at 22% in 2009, 2010, and then fell to 19% by 2011, 2012. And then we've seen a steady increase ever since. And that fall that we saw around the 2010s was at the tail end of the really significant reduction in pension poverty that we saw from about sort of 99, 2000 onwards. I'd agree with all of the comments that Tim was making in terms of the root causes. We see Londoners on low pay and living in poverty during their working life are, of course, much more likely to become Londoners living in poverty post-retirement. I think you might have seen a lot of the information that was being shared earlier in the week about, on International Women's Day in relation to women's pension contributions being lower throughout their working lives, feeding into poverty in later life. I think some of the factors worth flagging up that particularly affect London are the housing costs and seeing the impact of that, although it is not quite as straightforward as you would imagine. So we've seen a huge increase in the number of people aged 50 to 64 living in the private rented sector over the past 10 years. It's increased from 29 to 36%. And that is a huge increased pressure on incomes for those people as they age. Saying that, the number of older Londoners who privately rent, who live in poverty, stands at about 34%. Whereas in London, the proportion of people living in social rented housing in poverty stands at 44%. So it's not necessarily the case that the pressure of the private rented sector, because there's other factors at play there. It's also worth mentioning that Londoners tend to work later into life than the rest of the country. And this ties into what Tim had mentioned in terms of the disparities of incomes. We have some people working much later into life on quite sort of high quality, highly paid work. And then we also have people working much later into life on very, very low paid work, and quite often working later into life part-time, so even lower incomes again. And then final factors that I wanted to mention is we know that the poverty rate for single pensioners across the country is double that of couples, and there are more people living in single households in London than in the rest of the country. So there's another factor there. I also just wanted to mention all of the data that I've been talking about, and I imagine that my colleagues will be talking about too, is generally up to about 2021. And then we're seeing the impact of the increased cost of living that's going on right now. We haven't seen the impact of that in data, but it's most likely to see things going in a more negative direction. There's been a little bit of polling that HK London did back in October of last year, and this was just subjective polling of Londoners over the age of 60. But in October, 36% of them said that they were struggling to make ends meet, and 42% said that they thought they would be struggling financially in 6 months' time. Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned the fact that there's quite a high proportion of Londoners who are working, at a later stage in their life. And do you have any idea of the professions exactly? You talked about the lower end and the higher end, but has there been any analysis on the actual jobs that they're doing?
I don't know about the specific professions, but I think it's probably certainly at the lower paid end of that. It's the jobs that we all generally know are lower paid. At the other end, I could speculate, but I don't know exactly.
Okay, thank you so much. And we've got Luke Price is also on line.
Hi. Yeah. I would agree with everything everyone's already said. The only quick things I would add is that nationally we've seen a trend of relative poverty rising, which I think Abigail mentioned, and part of the reason for this is because the UK state pension is kind of becoming increasingly inadequate, and it's actually one of the worst in Europe. It provides around 58% of earnings from work, which is lower than the OECD average. So people who are mostly are wholly reliant on that can struggle to make ends meet. I guess the other thing I'd say is it's also important to kind of take a sort of life course perspective and think about the accumulation of disadvantage over someone's life. And we know that, for example, there are trends around healthy life expectancy, and disability-free life expectancy continues to get worse. We're living longer with health issues, and of course, if you've got health issues, then you are more likely to be in poverty and more likely to have less wealth. So that's another really important factor here, thinking about health. The other quick thing I'd throw in, and we might get onto this a bit more later when we talk about sort of employment and economic inactivity, but on ethnicity, there's some research from the TUC that shows that economically inactive older workers from Black and minority ethnic groups are 4 times more likely than those from white groups to be able to work due to caring responsibilities. So of course that will have an impact on people's finances if they're having to look after family and home, and therefore not able to earn money. And the other thing I'd just quickly throw in is there are huge sort of inequalities in wealth in the older age group. So obviously, unsurprisingly, perhaps average wealth tends to increase with age. The gap between the wealthiest and the least wealthy also gets much larger. So at 65, the wealthiest have around 41 times the wealth than the least wealthy. So there's these huge inequalities within the generations. That's also really important to think about.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned about health. So I presume, would you say that there are more likely to be older people who have increased disabilities that are impacting their access to work?
Yeah, so I guess I'm talking, on a broad population level. The measure of disability-free life expectancy, we are living longer in ill health generally, and that's kind of becoming more of a problem. And we've seen from a lot of kind of the labour market statistics and things like that recently that ill health is perhaps not the most important reason that people are leaving work, but it is the most important reason why people are staying out of work. So it's creating, and this is health conditions lasting over 12 months and also disabilities. So this is creating a big barrier for people who may otherwise want to work getting back into work. And there's a whole host of reasons for that again, I'm sure we'll get onto in a bit around, whether the right work is available, whether employers are thinking about how they can be more inclusive, but also about employment support services and how they traditionally fail the older age group in particular, but also people with health issues as well. So there'll be some older people who have health issues that will be doubly failed by a lot of kind of publicly provided employment support services.
Yeah, it sounds like there's pretty much like a double whammy for all of those groups. If you're an older Londoner and then add on the other aspects, the challenge is just double. We're going to move on to next Assembly Member, Sean Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Morning to our guests. Just quickly, I'd like to pose a question to Abigail. Abigail, in your opening comments, you said there was a small fall in poverty rates for elderly people. Do we have any understanding of why that was the case?
I think most likely, as I said, it was the tail end of the reduction in poverty amongst older people that began around 2000. So there was rising levels of home ownership, there were higher incomes from private pensions and earnings, and there was an increase in state support. So those sort of 20 years when broadly it fell, and then we saw it starting to pick up again around 2011, 2012. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. And this is a question I'd posed to everyone. When will there be a positive impact from auto-enrolment, and if so, when? Because a lot of this conversation is based around people who have no pension or have very poor pension provision, and auto-enrolment was invented, as it were, to help negate that. So do we feel like the effect is yet to hit home? Maybe I'll start with Tim.
At some point in the future, yes. Yeah. I mean, it's difficult to sort of quantify that. I mean, I think the issues are that clearly there are particular groups who traditionally have not had a pension, and I think the difficulty that's compounding the problem now is that there are a lot of older workers who are in what one would call precarious jobs that don't necessarily have support and pensions and all of that. And so that's a kind of a problem that I think has to be addressed. And of course, that precarious nature of work is obviously related to kind of in-work poverty, which is I think a big issue in London. There was a report last year by the Social Market Foundation that kind of identified what the issues were. So you're correct, but of course the problem I think with pensions is really the issue at the present moment, where people have taken their pension in terms of, in inverted commas, early retirement. There is some evidence that that some people don't have sufficient resources to equip themselves for the future in terms of the level of pension. And that's something which Phoenix and some other organisations are looking at the present moment, which is that gap, which potentially could actually have problems for future poverty rates, down to the fact that there are there isn't that pension pot.
Okay, thank you. Would anybody else like to make a comment? Okay, I'll take silence. My last small question is, the proportion of working age adults with children, working age adults without children, and pensioners living in poverty is lower now than it was in 2010. So how is it that other groups why is this particular group, pensioners in the context London, why are they immune to all of the changes, positive, that other groups have had? Is it something that's a special challenge for this particular group of older people? Why don't I start with Abigail, please?
Would you mind repeating the question?
So, the proportion of working age adults with children, working age adults without children, and pensioners living in poverty is lower now than it was in 2010. And I'm trying to understand: is there a particular group of pensioners who seem to be the very hardest to help? Why is this rate going up, and why is this particular group not feeling the benefits in the way that some other groups may be?
I mean, looking at the data that I've got access to, broadly, certainly amongst older Londoners, the overall poverty rates are higher than they were in 2010. There's obviously variation within that, and I think if you look at nationwide statistics, it's about the same compared to 10 years ago. But obviously, as previous colleagues have said, there are variations in different experiences within that, beyond those who are sitting just around the poverty line compared to those more fully embedded in it.
Okay, I think. Okay, thank you for your answer. I'll interrogate this more, Chair, when I come to my next set of questions. Question 2.
Okay, thank you. Assemblyman.
I'm on to question 2.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
I was wondering if that was the way you wanted to ask that question.
No, sorry. Abigail, I'm going to start with Abigail and come to some others, but let me have another stab at this. Why are poverty levels for older people higher in London than in the rest of the country?
I think there's a range of factors at play here. I think London's demography is part of it. So we have more single-person households in London, and being a single person, the age of 60 puts you at greater risk of living in poverty than being in a couple household. In London, there are also greater levels of some of the ethnic groups who are more likely to experience poverty. So I think it was the Joseph Rowntree Foundation who flagged up last week that half of all people in households headed by someone of Bangladeshi ethnicity living in poverty. And then there's, as I've also mentioned before, there's the factor of housing costs in London that are sitting a lot higher than in other areas. So I think those are probably the primary drivers, but I imagine there are other more complicated and more nuanced reasons that sit behind it, and this one area where we could really do with probably with more data and more insight.
Okay, thank you. Luke, maybe?
Got nothing to add to that. I think that was a good answer.
Thank you. Tim?
I mean, I'd echo what Abby has said. I mean, I think what it illustrates for me is that we need more. This is not going to be a helpful answer, but we need much more data about London. We need a lot more evidence about. And in a sense, I don't feel that we have ONS statistics, we have some other sort of research that you can look down in terms of the patterns within London. But I think we need to have them at the present moment. One of the key ingredients moving forward is to have much better data that kind of can explain some of the trends that are around.
When we talk about some of the demographies inside of this group, are older, for instance, West Indian people more likely to be in poverty than younger West Indian people? Is it just a case of, you've been in poverty your whole life and that just transfers with you? Or are you even more at risk in our at-risk groups of being in poverty as you become older?
I don't know the full answer to that, but certainly if we look at poverty rates of younger West Indian people, that poverty rates will be high there. I think that a certain amount is a kind of cycle of deprivation, a sort of phenomenon, as it were. And the issues, I think, are more that with older ethnic groups, there's a question of their sort of overall resources, their overall kind of access to work. There's in-work poverty that affects those groups, and I think that is a problem that, in a sense, you don't get out of that before you get into pension age, as it were.
Okay, because I'm trying to understand if it's something special to becoming a pensioner, or if the community is poor the whole way through, because that could change where you
and it's probably both, but quantifying what the effect is at both ends is probably going to be key.
Oh, okay. Chair, I'll stop there and I'll come back with my next set of questions. Thank you.
Okay, Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, panel. Before I go on to my questions, Abigail, I wonder if you could clarify something that you said. The sound went a bit strange. I think you said that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation had said that a percentage or a high percentage of those in poverty were headed by a Bangladeshi household. Could you just, headed by somebody from a Bangladeshi background, could you just go back and clarify that for me, please?
Yeah, of course. So what the findings of their most recent poverty report was that half of all people in households headed by someone of Bangladeshi ethnicity were in poverty in 2020-21.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the clarification. So my question is to Luke. Luke, what impact will the rise of the state pension age have on the poverty levels and financial security of older Londoners?
So we did some research with the Institute for Fiscal Studies looking at the most recent rise in the state pension age and kind of what impact that had on poverty and the financial security of older people. And the headline figure is that the changes, so people having to retire later, has made people poorer. Basically what happens is people who can't retire at the age they would have done originally then end up having to rely on the less generous working age benefit system before it gets to the kind of state pension age. So that has meant that poverty has risen, and we've seen a reduction in household income for those over 65, leading to a rise in absolute income poverty. This is at the national level in this age group by 13 percentage points, so quite a large increase for those people with low household incomes. And there's also an inequalities angle here. The increase of the poverty rate is larger for those for single people, for people with fewer educational qualifications, and also for people who are renting. That's both social and private. So again, I think this speaks to some of the points we've been talking about. And the housing situation will probably be more acute in London in that sense. And then just very quickly, just if I may go back to the auto-enrolment question, I agree it's quite hard to work out when that's going to have an effect. But one of the things is, whilst it's been a huge policy success, one of the potential downsides is that people think that what you save through auto-enrolment is enough to save for your pension. And actually, that's not necessarily the case. And so people may be kind of saving the minimum through auto-enrolment and then not actually saving enough for their pensions in their life. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you. Are there disproportionate impacts on any group within this demographic due to gender or ethnicity with regard to the pension issue?
I don't have any stats relating to that to hand. The research we did, I don't think, found anything on that, so I can't say for sure.
Thank you. What impact, and we have touched on the cost of living crisis, and I'd like you to go into this a little bit more. What impact has the cost of living crisis had on older Londoners specifically, in your opinion?
Well, it's made it more difficult to get by, I guess, as you know, the very simple level as the prices go up and people's money isn't going up, whether that's through benefits or wages or more, you know, with the big problems we're seeing in terms of people leaving the labour market, that has also meant that people are struggling to kind of make ends meet. I guess the other thing that we're not quite clear on yet, there has been some recent research that suggests that older people who left the labour market since the beginning of the pandemic, many of whom chose to retire early, and there's kind of many of those will have been, you know, financially secure enough to retire early, but some of those people are now returning. So there is a question whether this is a longer trend or not, whether people have actually realised that maybe they haven't got quite as much money to be as comfortable as they thought they would be, and therefore having to try and return to work to increase their financial security.
So if people are trying to return to work, is that happening? I mean, how easy are people finding that at the moment? Have you got any research to look into that?
It's a bit early to say with the most recent stats, not least because we don't yet know whether it's a trend, but it's likely that many people, for a whole host of reasons, many older people will find returning to work a struggle, not least because there are large barriers in relation to health, in relation to care and responsibilities, in relation to ageism, in relation to whether the right type of work exists. We know that flexible working is really important for this age group, and not all employers offer it. So some people will certainly struggle to return to work. And there, you know, there's evidence that shows that the longer you're out of work, the harder it is to get back into work, and that's even more acute at older ages.
Okay, and finally, has the government done enough to help older London struggling in the cost of living crisis?
I think I might have to pass this to someone else. I'm not sure on the answer to that one.
Who would we like to pass it to? Abigail?
So from a London-focused perspective, it's tricky because, of course, a lot of the main levers that affect the incomes of older Londoners sit with the government, and these are the things that my colleagues at AGK have been calling for the government to do to boost the incomes of older people more generally. In terms of London, as I said, there are fewer specific levers. One area that I did particularly want to flag up was uptake of pension credit. So pension credit, the benefit for older people on the lowest incomes. Uptake of that is particularly low in London, so it stands at about 80%. And this is one of the areas in which it perhaps would be possible to boost the incomes of the poorest older people if we could get the uptake of that benefit to a higher level, 90, 95%, perhaps even beyond that. That would make a real meaningful difference. I know that there's some action, I think perhaps Sonia might be able to talk about it in terms of different tactics, sending targeted letters, postcards to older people to let them know that they are likely to be eligible for this. But I've got to say, broadly, I think the approach in trying to encourage uptake has been the same over the past few years, and the results have been the same. And I would encourage the Mayor to look at perhaps trying some different, slightly more creative approaches, because this is one way that we can meaningfully increase older people's incomes.
Do you have any suggestions for a more creative approach?
Probably it's a case of trying out different things and seeing which ones work and then rolling them out across London. So trying to think about contacting older people about it, thinking about who that communication needs to come from, that they're most trusted by, thinking about kind of the wording, the approach. I think we need to think beyond things like, it's very nice that posters go up in libraries and stuff to let people know about it, but that really doesn't seem to have much difference at all. So looking in a lot more detail about messaging, targeting, who it comes from, and trying those things out and seeing if, even sort of a 5% increase in uptake there would start to make a difference.
Is the lack of intake, the low intake, to do with trust issues, or are there other reasons for that?
I think there's a whole range of issues. There are old Londoners who simply don't know that they are eligible. There are old people who are living in poverty and struggling, but assume that other people have it worse, so they can't be eligible for it. The sort of internalised ageism of the expectation that perhaps their quality of life shouldn't be particularly good. There's that area. There's concern. Certainly, it's something that's been picked up by educators across London delivering services. Concern that if they take that money and they're not really struggling, then they're taking money away from someone else. So sort of an altruistic aversion from it. Then there's also the process of applying for it overall, which is a bit of a nightmare, bluntly. And obviously, the process for applying for it, that's something that sits with government. But if we can encourage more people to be actually applying for it, and ensuring that they know that they're eligible, that it's something that they're entitled to. This feeling of not wanting to claim something, not wanting to be a burden, is something that's picked up quite frequently. So making sure the message is very much in terms of this is something that they deserve and that they should be able to receive.
Thank you, Abigail. My final question is for Sonia Khan. Sonia, from your experience of working with older people in Hackney, what are levels of financial resilience like, and how has this changed in recent years?
Thank you. So Hackney is a borough where we have older people who are more likely to be on lower incomes. And so 40% of those aged 60 over are either in receipt of pension credit or eligible, or earn less than the national average and therefore are considered to be in poverty. And also our employment rate is higher, our unemployment rate is higher for those over 50. The other side of that is that at the moment, 2/3 of the group over 65 live in social housing. So that's a high number, but the trend is towards people living in private rented sector. So the number of people we'd expect to see in private rented sector who are older is going to increase, and that means that they're going to be much more vulnerable to rental increases and how that affects what's in their budget. So that was the position pre-pandemic. And then in terms of what's changed since the pandemic, we're still, the data's still emerging. So I'm going to use a combination of national data and also what we know from the resident insight that we've got from the work we do. So, I think the first thing to say, and this is obviously going to be something very current in the budget announcements as well, is that we have nearly 500,000 people nationally, 50 to 70, who've become economically inactive during the pandemic. And certainly in London, the over 50s were impacted along with the younger age group during the pandemic more than other groups. And locally, our Job Centre Plus, so DWP, have reported that they have a significant caseload of over 50s. So that's a picture of both the income that we had before the pandemic, but also how that's likely to have changed. And so we are expecting people to be living on lower incomes because they've left the labour market during the pandemic. And then from the resident insight that we've got, we are concerned that older residents have been impacted from the pandemic through poorer health directly, through COVID and related health conditions that have continued, or indirectly by, say, being shielders and then being concerned about going out, so being more isolated, being concerned about going back into a workplace. If people have left the workplace during the pandemic, as we expect to see from national and local data, then as the cost of living crisis has kicked in and bills have gone up, even if people are in social housing and so there is some protection, then people are going to be struggling because the assumptions they made leaving, having left the labour market, they can't necessarily, those assumptions don't hold in terms of what they need to be able to survive. We recently have worked, I lead on our poverty reduction work, and we've recently been working closely with the community shops that we have in the area that are like food banks, but charge a small amount for people to be able to access affordable food. And we worked with them to distribute support to pensioners directly, and that has exposed a level of unmet need. It goes back to the point that was being made about stigma, about people in this age group not wanting to ask for help. But actually, when we tried to do really targeted work, we saw that there were a lot of people who were probably struggling, who weren't on any voluntary sector or council service radar at the time, who came through. So that's the trends that we're seeing at the moment, I can talk as we go on about how that might affect longer term trends as well.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. And we all wait with bated breath for the budget announcement that hasn't already been leaked. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bailey, you have an additional question?
Thank you. Can I just quickly address Sonia, please? Sonia, there's some £2.4 billion in pension credit and housing benefit that hasn't been claimed. What are your claim levels like in Hackney? Are you finding ways to find people to make sure they're getting the full help that they are entitled to? What are your levels like?
So our levels have fallen. So we did have a large amount of unclaimed pension credit. We've been doing targeted work. We've been using data sets that tell us who should be claiming pension credit and contacting people. So that we've now got, the latest data was about 600 people still to support into accessing pension credit. The approach that we've had to take has been linked to the wider approach around poverty reduction, and it's been a combination of proactively contacting people, but as you can imagine, not everybody wants to pick up the phone. There's a lot of warnings about scams, so you're not necessarily going to respond well to what is effectively cold calling. So the fact we have the data isn't enough. So then what we've done is we've combined that with the work that we're doing at a grassroots level, where we're working really closely with organisations who have the contact, who are working with older people, and rather than the people in the council, calling people, it's about creating outreach. So going out to those spaces, equipping those organisations to be able to identify people who they know and have those conversations that need to be quite sensitive. And that approach, understanding who you're talking about, but then being able to work with, I think Abby referred to this, finding more innovative ways to work directly with those who have the trusted contact is the way that we're going to get to reduce that number down.
Thank you for that, because I think you've answered one of our earlier questions about how we disseminate this information. I used to run a 60-plus day centre, and I know that if we were given this information, we were trusted in our community and could then pass it on. So thank you for that. It's a really good answer, Sonia. Thank you. So my last quick question is, according to the Centre for Better Ageing, the number of over 50s in the workplace has dramatically grown over the last 20 years. I'll come to you, Tim. Would you say this is just down to the increase in the state pension age, or is it something else about people trying to personally combat their own poverty?
I think the growth in employment is something that, as you say, has grown. The issue is more about, some people are doing it because they want to work longer. Some people are doing it because they've got the need for to get more income, as it were. What the interesting issue is that trend has been bucked by the post-pandemic era, which is a big issue. And I think the difficulty that we've got is knowing what will happen to the labour market for over 50s over the next few years, and that's why I think there needs to be concerted effort put in to actually tackling some of those problems, because clearly there is an economic need for that kind of labour participation rate to be a lot higher. There's something about skills, which we don't quite know whether people that have exited the labour market, what the effect on skills level in companies and organisations in London might be. But there's also a kind of an issue about sort of social welfare, which is more about the fact that if people can keep working and there aren't the barriers, and the barriers can be unfortunately down to health and caring responsibilities, but the barriers are often about ageism, which I think are really, ageism is the elephant in the room in a lot of these discussions. And I think that there is a need to kind of increase that participation rate. And that's why I think the people leaving the market at the present moment is something that one needs to watch quite carefully in terms of what that pattern is and will it bounce back. Interestingly, London is the area probably out of all the regions in the UK where those who might return to work is actually higher. And they're saying that because they're wanting to kind of get back into the labour market, but there are conditions around that. They want the right location, they want jobs that suit their skills, they want flexibility, they want pay and all of that. And I think that we need to kind of be looking at this issue more in terms of what are the factors from a demand side, i.e. what employers can provide, which will be something that will enable older workers to keep working, particularly with higher state pension age in the future.
Okay, thank you for that, Tim. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We're moving on to Assembly Member Polanski, who's online.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, panel. Abby, if I can start with you, I want to ask about digital exclusion, and I want to ask how much does this impact older Londoners and their financial security?
Yes, so it certainly is a factor. I mean, bluntly, having access to the internet enables you to buy an awful lot of things more cheaply than if you buy them in person. So particularly thinking about things like utilities, price comparison websites for all those things. If you don't have access to that, then often you are paying a sort of a non-digital premium, as it were. So that feeds into one aspect of it. The other thing that I wanted to flag up is an issue that HK London's been talking about for the past couple of months, which is about how digital exclusion can impact on your ability to access certain financial support, particularly financial support through councils. So we did some FOI requests last year, asking all councils in London if it was possible to apply for certain benefits, including council tax reduction and housing benefit, without using the internet. And a third of councils replied to us saying, no, we don't offer a way to apply for those if you don't use the internet. So that's really concerning in terms of blocking off barriers to boosting people's incomes. You know, that there are ways around that people can sometimes do. Sometimes there's support offered by services like local educators who might help with that a little bit. Increasingly, those services are very stretched and very underfunded. And for some people, it simply doesn't work at all. They have no way of accessing it. When we did some mystery shopping to follow up on those findings, you know, occasionally you do hear things people saying, well, can't you ask your children to help you apply for it? And some people don't really want to share all their financial details with their children, their neighbour, whoever can help them with that. So that's an issue of real concern. I understand that councils are under financial pressures and online-only services can allow them to target the money that they have effectively. But at the moment, we are seeing a significant number of older Londoners in those boroughs where they can't access that support. That needs to change. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for flagging that, Abby. It's incredibly important, and thank you for reaching out like that. There's councillors in the chamber, and certainly all of us have relationships with councillors, and we should all take that up on our councils. Theo, if I can turn to you, this same question really about digital exclusion and how much of a factor it is in financial security for older Londoners.
I think it's, thank you for the question. I think it's really important that we don't look at older people as a sort of big mass. I don't think anyone is suggesting that it's one a whole group of people. And the work we've done with the London Office of Technology and Innovation at London Councils, which represents 26 of the 32 boroughs, took a slightly different view on digital exclusion than the sort of library of reports on digital exclusion in the past, which sort of tend to lump people together. And that looked at older people and people who were excluded in terms of personas. And they've done a report, which we financed, and it looked at older people in a number of categories. Firstly, 50 plus who are unemployed and lack digital skills. Secondly, 65 plus with health needs. Thirdly, 65 plus who had some kit but were struggling with cost. Fourth, 65 plus who are isolated. Fifth, 65 plus who had never used the internet. And finally, 65 plus who had caring responsibilities to others. All of these people have different digital exclusion needs. And I think all of them, coming to your question about the financial impact, will therefore have different financial impacts depending on the type of digital exclusion that they have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Last year, as you know, I launched a campaign called Spy Free Shopping, which is essentially around supermarkets being honest with customers around their data and making sure that where they were using private facial recognition, they were honest with customers about that. Now, one of the arguments was that people could always choose to go to another supermarket. Now, I take your point about not treating older people as a huge mass. But of course, a lot of older people might have mobility issues, as younger people might as well, but disproportionately so. How important is it that people are able to use their local supermarket or their local sources, essentially, in their community without feeling like they're being spied on?
Is that a question for,
yes,
for
please.
me? It's not a. I mean, to be honest, it's not an issue that I've come. I mean, I know of your campaign, but it's not an issue that I've come across that people have particularly raised surveillance as a barrier to getting food.
Okay, thank you very much, Theo. Abby, if I can turn to you again, and finally, this is on Transport for London, and on a separate note, solidarity to the strikers today. Age UK have done brilliant work alongside my colleague Caroline Russell around public toilets. How much of an impact is having a so-called loo leash having on older Londoners and their financial security in terms of getting about?
I think sort of all of these issues are interconnected. I think the question of needing access to decent public toilets, to be honest, it's one that cuts across various different income levels. It isn't necessarily one that is experienced more severely by people on low incomes, although it could be. We don't have enough data showing things like which areas have more or less public toilets. It could be in more deprived areas there are fewer. I think it's one that's really experienced across the board. In terms of the free travel before 9 a.m, I would say I don't think that particularly intersects with the problem of public toilet provision, saying that it still is an ongoing issue. It's very much not all Londoners over the age of 60 that need and struggle to afford to travel before 9 a.m, but there is a significant minority who are really affected by it. Some research that we did towards the end of last year, we found of those who did need to travel before 9 a.m, 28% said it prevented them from making important journeys. 27% said they were cutting their costs elsewhere in order to be able to afford their travel. 16% said it had prevented them from caring for a friend or a family member, and 13% of them told us that they had stopped work as a result of it.
That's quite striking. You predicted my question about the Freedom Pass before I even asked it, so I'll end my question there, but just also to note that in City Hall today there is a launch of London Travel Watch, who are launching a report into digital exclusion and disadvantage in London transport, which feels like a very fitting day for us to be having this meeting. I was going to hand over to the chair, but I sense, Abby, you want to say something else.
Yeah, because I just want to mention one final point, which is the cost of accessing the internet, which is a factor for some older people. And one of the issues that we've picked up is that most major internet providers offer social tariffs, which you're probably aware of. And they're generally talked about in terms of these are deals available for those on the lowest income. Until quite recently, they were just there for those in receipt of universal credit, as in you pass a birthday, you become of pensionable age, and suddenly you're not eligible for this low-cost deal anymore. We've seen quite a lot of movement towards the end of last year in terms of internet providers changing their eligibility criteria. But there are still a few who I don't think they intentionally exclude older people from these most affordable deals, but inadvertently a few of them still do. And some of the others are quite good at hiding the information about it. They technically do offer it, but you have to be pretty good at searching around a website to find out about it. So yeah, that's another aspect of the sort of financial inclusion and digital exclusion.
Thanks, Abby. I really appreciate this. At this point, I want to turn to the Deputy Mayor if they were here and ask how the Mayor of London could help with this. But I note the Chair's comments at the beginning that they're not there, and I'd like to express my disappointment.
Yes, you make a good point there.
Thank you very much, Chair.
I will definitely be putting that within my letter later on. We are going to be moving on to another aspect called economic inactivity amongst older Londoners. But I do want to just thank Theo for mentioning the fact that the older Londoners are not a homogenous group. They're not all the same, and I think that's an important thread that we need to make sure that we keep clarifying throughout this discussion. And digital exclusion as well is not necessarily about a lack of skills, it's also the cost as well. So thank you very much for those really important points. We're moving on to Assembly Member Garrett now. Thank you.
Morning. If I start with you, Tim. Questions about sort of economic inactivity among older Londoners. So there's been during the pandemic a rise in economic inactivity among older Londoners. What do you think are the main sort of drivers of that change?
I think there are a whole mix of things that come together, and this is part of the problem of how you kind of dissect that phenomenon. I mean, there clearly were more older workers affected by furlough, being made redundant, which meant that they left the labour market. Some of those clearly have decided that they have got sufficient resources, perhaps, to be able to equip themselves in retirement and are staying out of the market. Others, I think, the economic inactivity rates are affected by ill health, which was an issue before the pandemic, but I think has come into sharper relief. It's not necessarily post-COVID type health issues. It's an intensification, I think, of some of the health issues that people have. And clearly there's also issues around economic activity and caring responsibilities as well. But it's quite a complex pattern, and it's quite difficult to get good data at a London level, I think, on that. But probably what's important is more about how do you tackle then the repercussions of that, and how do you ensure that people who, and the particular group that's important here are those who are in economic inactivity but who want to work. They may have been out of the labour market for a period of time. They are quite an important group. Those who've left it and don't want to go to work maybe are ones that you aren't going to be able to entice back. But certainly those who are wanting to go back to work, that's quite important. And of course, one issue there is about how do you facilitate them coming back into the labour market, given that only 1 in 10 who get kind of employment support through job centres, it means there's a lot of people out there who may need advice but who aren't necessarily getting it. But then there's issues about long-term unemployed people who, and I think what's worrying about the latest ONS data is that what that's showing is that those who've been unemployed over the age of 50, that's actually gone up in the last quarter. So clearly there are people there who are kind of trapped in unemployment. And of course, the longer you are out of employment, the more difficult when you're older is it to get back in. But then there's issues, I think, around economic activity and particular groups, ethnic groups and women, and both of those groups, there are higher economic inactivity rates. And I think that the issues then are about how do you kind of tackle some of those, and how do you address some of the health issues? And are the health issues about access to NHS services? Are they about mental illness issues? There's a whole set of things. And so I think that there's a need to unpack economic inactivity, but be looking at what needs might be, and then trying to tailor, I think, collectively across. I think one of the things that we would argue is that you need to be taking an approach which is bringing together different partners to look at all those sort of issues, and how do you best develop employment support and the right sort of advice.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. You've actually anticipated my next question was going to be about impact of long-term unemployment. I think that was partly covered earlier. Yeah. I think you've covered it again. The bit I'm interested in is this sort of teasing out of different groups. So within that group of people, sort of economically inactive, I suppose particularly young retirees, people in their late 50s, early 60s, to what extent is that people who have just chosen, maybe they've got really good pension, they've had, good career, and they've decided, you know what, let's just not bother. Let's take this opportunity to step off the labour market, go to the golf course or wherever young retired people go. And obviously that's a very different group of people that we probably have very different questions and maybe concerns about from these people who are sort of stuck, who would like to get back into work but can't. Do we have any? So I think you're right to sort of distinguish, the differences between groups of people who might fall under the same economic heading. Is there any sense of what proportion, for example, the higher furlough rate, to what extent that was voluntary, or and within this category of economically inactive young retirees, do we know what proportion are voluntarily in that position versus what proportion would really like to come back but are struggling?
I mean, there is the data, and it might be worth trying to summarise that together with Luke to sort of get a sort of a handle on that, because I think it is important in policy responses. I mean, the issue of people who've kind of or experience the pandemic and decide that they're going to sort of exit the job market because they've got the level of resources. I mean, they're a group that I think, unfortunately, the media headlines have concentrated on going back to the golf course, and I think that is the wrong analogy, because actually...
Well, apologies for propagating a terrible myth.
But I think it's important because there is a risk group in that, which I don't think we've heard a great deal about, which is those who actually are making that decision but actually haven't got the pension resources. And they are quite an important group, because they may be not necessarily high earners in the past, so therefore they're at risk of poverty. I think that the one issue which again is a little bit of the elephant in the room here, and there is some research on this, which is about the lower levels of job satisfaction that older workers may have, and that can be a predictor of people exiting the job market. There is some research, I think, that Southampton University have done, the Medical Research Council unit there, which has been looking at the relationship between job satisfaction and exiting the job market for health reasons. So it's something about, there's a trigger between where you're not happy in your job and that affects your health. There's a lot of those sorts of issues which I think need to be teased out. And I think with some people it's about the feeling maybe that they've kind of experienced their working life, but they don't feel that there is the right level of attunement to their needs, and that's about flexibility. It's about maybe them suffering from ageism, the lack of training opportunities. All of these things are factors that kind of don't help older workers, because we're not kind of talking them up. What we're doing is essentially there are sort of lot of barriers there, and I think the worrying point for me are those who are probably in their 50s who are exiting for particular reasons, because they are ones that, in a sense, have got a long time to wait until state pension. Interestingly, and I can't explain this, but London has the highest rate of over 65s in work. It's about 14%, and some boroughs it's actually at 20%, and that actually is something to celebrate. But it goes against some of the trends elsewhere in that age group. And I think one of the problems of looking at this is that we're treating people from 50 to 70. It's quite a wide group. And we're also looking at people who are in their late 40s. If you talk to some people in the IT sector, they will say we're starting to feel ageist issues when we're in our late 40s. So we need to kind of perhaps unpack for measurement, I think, some of that age group in a slightly different way.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose I would make the observation that if we have a high proportion of over 65s in work, that might be a good thing if they have fulfilling work that they can do from home over Zoom, or it might be a bad thing if they feel under pressure to do work they don't enjoy and don't want because of their financial pressure. So do I infer from your answer that the difficulty in teasing out the difference between, say, the comfortably early retired and the uncomfortably struggling to get into the labour market, that there's not really good evidence about who they are, what the difference?
No, I think that will come in time, and there's obviously more research coming out literally day by day on over 50s. But I think that there is a need to kind of step back and say, well, what are the conditions that can exist which help older workers? And this is more not just to tackle the problems of economic inactivity now, but at a point where, with baby boomers sort of retiring in the future, less younger workers in the labour market, how do you create a kind of a culture that is allowing people to work more flexibly, people that can kind of continue working, a way that people don't feel that they shouldn't be applying for jobs? There's a lot of what is called internal ageism around, where you've internalised it so that you don't feel you're equipped to apply. There's evidence of workers who feel that they're sort of locked out of the job market because they go for interviews, they're unsuccessful, and that does increase with age. Perhaps they feel that they are viewed as perhaps too expensive or don't have the skills. And I think that a lot of that, when you look at the headlines, it kind of is very crude. So it doesn't get into the issues around what are the positive benefits of older workers in workplaces, and also what skills are there. And there are examples of organisations who've used older workers in a slightly different way, in a more flexible way, and also they've used them because they're good on, for example, social and diplomatic skills, for example. I mean, their technology skills might be something that needs to be updated, but there are skills that are there. And the question is more, I think it's more about the extent to which employers are thinking hard enough and actually practicing a lot of what the rhetoric is about age-friendly workplaces.
Yeah, that makes sense. Seeing potential and opportunities rather than obstacles. You mentioned Luke. So Luke, did you want to add anything on this question of older Londoners leaving the labour market during the pandemic and the reasons for that, and maybe the different types of reasons and different types of circumstance that lead to that?
Yeah, sure. So I'd echo what Tim just said in terms of the data, particularly at a London level, not being particularly good. So I'm relying a lot on national data here, although I imagine some of the trends would be quite similar. But I guess what we've seen in terms of the main driver of outflows from employment to economic inactivity, so people leaving jobs, leaving the labour market, is mostly retirement. That's the largest number. And then health is an important issue, but a smaller absolute number of people who are leaving the labour market due to it. And actually what we're seeing is a worsening of health amongst those people who've been out of the labour market for a longer time. And actually the conversation about kind of the retirement thing does hide some really important inequalities, and means that we're not talking about this group with health issues that actually, as Tim was kind of talking, employers can do better and employment support can do better. In terms of those who are retiring, the vast majority of them nationally say they've got no desire or expectation to return to work. So encouraging them back might be quite difficult, not least because many of the people who have chosen to retire are relatively financially secure. We know that those who left during the pandemic and didn't return, the majority, around 2/3, own their home outright. Again, this is nationally, and are much more likely to be debt-free than those who left the labour market and returned. So there's clearly a financial angle here. And there are some estimates from Phoenix Insights that those aged 50 to 64 choosing to retire have a median household wealth of about 1.25 million. Of course, it's a median, so that kind of, the big outliers skew that figure, but that's 20 times more than the 57,000 median household wealth of those who are leaving the labour market due to sickness in this age group. So there's a huge inequality here, and it's really important that we don't, even though in absolute numbers, in terms of outflows from employment to economic activity, health is seemingly a less important reason. There are still, a significant minority of people here that have been forced to leave because of health issues, some of whom will want to work and are just not getting the right opportunities from employers, or are not being supported by employment support services in a way that actually enables them to do so. And it's also really important to note on this kind of stats issue, and the evidence is that often, like labour force survey and stuff like that, mostly focuses on the main reason. So people may say they're retiring, but they may also have a long-term health condition. So that skews it slightly. Just kind of quickly on the health points, because I think it's really important. Generally speaking, we're seeing the health of the population, including amongst older people, decline over time. As I said, it's a smaller driver of people leaving the labour market. What we might be seeing is a worsening of health of those who've already been out for a while. And as I can't remember who said it, the longer you've been out, the harder it is to get back in, and that's doubly compounded by having health issues. So it's certainly the most important reason that older people are staying out of the labour market, even if it's not the most important reason that they're leaving. And there's lots of research that shows that, at any age, hiring rates of those with long-term sickness is much lower, and the chance of being economically inactive with long-term sickness rises with age for both men and women. And we also know, in terms of those who are leaving the labour market, there are big inequalities by sector. So, for example, older people who worked in finance are 3 times more likely than older people who've worked in hospitality to have left due to retirement. So they're presumably worked in jobs that are paid better, managed to have better pensions, and therefore are more financially secure. And we've, older people who worked in process plant and machine operative jobs are 7 times more likely to leave the workforce early due to ill health than those in professional occupations. So there are stats out there that kind of look at the kinds of groups that might be leaving because they're financially secure and therefore are choosing to retire, versus those groups that maybe are leaving because of health reasons. And this again has implications for, the offer that employers are doing, but also what employment support looks like for those groups. So those are the main things I would add. I can talk a bit about impacts if that would be helpful, but that might be the next question. So,
what impact on what? You mean the impact of people being out of the labour market?
Yes, who would like? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to ask on the question on health. So there's obviously a correlation between being in ill health and being out of work, and I'm trying to understand which way the causality goes, because it may be that people who are out of work suffer declines in health for all sorts of reasons, probably related to loneliness and things as well. But equally, if you are in poor health anyway, then obviously that in itself becomes a bar. So is that research on to what extent one is causing the other, or to what extent they're causing each other on this correlation between health and non-working?
I would say it's both. There is evidence that suggests that having good work, so you talked a little bit about making sure people have work that they want to do and satisfies them and pays enough and all these kinds of questions, it has a protective effect on health. So actually, therefore, being unemployed can be quite damaging to your health. Equally, bad work can be quite damaging to your health, which is an important thing not to forget. But yes, it's your health might worsen when you're unemployed, but equally it is harder for people who have health issues to stay in work if their employers aren't offering the right support. And it can be harder for them to get back into work when employment support services, which traditionally, as someone talked about, 1 in 10 people get helped by the job centre. traditionally they don't work so well for the older age group, and they also don't particularly work that well for people with health issues. So we've got kind of this double jeopardy going on again for those who are older and also have health problems.
Is that because the job centres are not taking into account the complexity of the situation, and they're offering a sort of one size doesn't really fit them very well approach? I see lots of
yes. I mean, we've developed as an organisation some principles of what good employment support for this age group would look like. And an important point here, as you kind of raised, is that some of the provision that exists takes this kind of one size fits all, and actually it needs to be more personalised and more kind of attuned to the specific needs of the individual and the kinds of issues they may face with regards to health, with regards to caring responsibilities, with regards to updating skills for those who need it, or people who are retraining and changing careers, and they're not necessarily particularly effective at that. And we've seen that not just from the job centre, but the work programme. I don't have the stat to hand and it's gone out of my head, but the work programme, the worst outcomes were achieved for the oldest group. Obviously that ended a few years back and was kind of sort of replaced as spiritual successor, the work and health programme. That also wasn't particularly effective for older age groups, and the outcomes achieved, job outcomes after 24 months, went down with age. So the older you were, the worse, the less likely you were to get a job from that. So there's clearly something going on in the way these are designed, and part of that will be the fact that they're not particularly attuned to kind of the individual needs of older people looking for work.
Perhaps just an assumption that job seekers are younger people, maybe. So in terms of the impact, did you want to add something quickly on that was on the impact of being out of work? I think we had covered that. But was there something else you wanted to say?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Tim said about redundancy.
Okay.
We saw it's less important now than it was right at the start of the pandemic, but I don't like to indulge in future predictions, but if we do end up in a recession, then perhaps redundancy will become more important. But one stat that always sticks with me, that younger workers who were made redundant during the pandemic were twice as likely to be back in work than older workers within 6 months. So, that kind of scarring effect of being made redundant, leaving the labour market not out of choice, and then finding it more difficult to get back in is really important. So I guess that's the only other thing that I'd throw in there.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. The impact of that strikes me. There's a similar thing I've seen where people normally retire at the age they were expecting to. Suddenly they don't have the sort of sociability of being in work. Their sense of purpose can sometimes be lost, and that can cause quite a spiral into all kinds of things. So perhaps there's a similar effect here where people are retiring early, possibly even voluntarily, and then finding it's not all they were hoping. Finally, looking at it. Sorry, Abigail. I meant to ask you. Was there anything you wanted to add? I apologise for.
I don't think I've got anything to add beyond what
okay.
my colleagues have said.
Great. Okay. So, sort of looking at it from the other end of the telescope. So we've just been looking at it from the point of view of the individual and the impact on them of not being in work. Is there a sense of what's being lost, sort of from London business, from London employers, from London economy, about this group of people who may be quite happy in themselves not being in work, but whose sort of skills and abilities are being lost? Do we know, are there particular sectors that are being more affected? Are there particular impact that's having? I don't know. Did you? I think you sort of touched a bit on that earlier, Tim.
Yeah, I mean I think the way to answer that is that there's been, I think recently, and I can send it to you and colleagues, work looking at skill shortages and problems of recruitment by kind of businesses in London. And clearly, one issue that we're seeing right across the UK is that some employers are beginning to realise that they actually need to be attracting an older workforce. And so that quite a lot are putting in recruitment programmes that are more tailored for older workers. And I think that's a very positive thing. I think the other way of looking at some of this is about the fact that that you've got kind of succession planning, you've got loss of sort of corporate knowledge, corporate expertise, which is there, but you also, there's a kind of issue that that organisations don't always sort of plan adequately for the future, in the sense of making their kind of jobs sort of a sufficient quality that will be attractive to older people, but also they don't kind of look at retention. Because I think one of the big lessons from all of this is, why is it that people left? You know, I mean, clearly something is at work there, and it is about, and I think the lesson now for organisations is how do you retain people? How do you create the right level of support? How do you create flexible working? How do you have MOTs, sort of this advice system for older workers when they reach a particular stage? And I think that is the debate that we need to have for the future. And there are issues, I think, that the GLA could be stimulating that in terms of that debate and that discussion. I think the good organisations, the ones that are practising being age-friendly, do have those kind of systems in place and that thinking. But there's a lot that others don't, and you know, there are particular. I mean, it's a criticism levelled against the recruitment industry is that it often doesn't. That's not age friendly, and the question is, how do you kind of change that? So I think there are a number of issues where the loss of older workers is a problem, and I mean the only final one that I'd talk a little bit about is that sort of intergenerational issues are important in workplaces, and that's something which actually should be kind of stimulated and developed. But it does require quite a kind of change in the discussions and the agenda moving forward. And it's not just about more of the same. And I think my risk, and I don't know what Luke would say about this, is that there is a problem that you could be getting people back into work, but it's not in, you know, it might tick the box of saying, yes, there's a positive outcome, but it's not the right job. And actually they don't stay very long. And I think that's the question that we need to be looking at, and we need data on that, because otherwise all you're doing is you're solving an apparent problem, but actually you're not tackling the roots of that problem.
So is that an underemployment problem, where someone maybe with higher skills is being employed on a what they would see as a lesser job because that's all they can
It could be, or it could be that there aren't sufficient adjustments made for them. It might be that they've gone into a job and thought that they would be able to cope, or that they'd be able to be flexible in terms of the days they could work and things like that, but that's not apparent. It could be something about the culture which doesn't kind of big up older workers in an organisation.
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic that whenever we talk to employers, they tell us they can't find people.
Yep.
And then here we are hearing about how there's a whole load of people who would
Yep.
like to be found and apparently are not even being looked for. I mean, one of the things that, just to sort of put some sort of meat on it, as it were, one of the things we need to do is make some recommendations about what could be improved. So what could be done? Is there a sort of a report, some suggestions, some recommendations we could make to?
I think that there are, first of all, I think there's the point that I was making earlier about there needs to be a different debate. That is something that the Mayor and the GLA can stimulate. I don't think to date that the Mayor has kind of intervened in older workers' issues. But I think that as part of London becoming a sort of age-friendly city, it is really important that there is a bigger conversation about this, and I think the leadership role of the Mayor is really important here. What worries me is that some of the London think tanks that you kind of think would be taking some of these issues, they aren't addressing it. If you look at what some put on in terms of future employment, it isn't about how do we cope with older workers, or how do we plan for an ageing society. So I think the Mayor can do that, and it requires, I think, a strategic approach, and it needs to be right across different partners, which is really important. I mean, the Local Government Association have this work local principle, which I think is really valuable as a way of looking at things. But it's also about tackling ageism as well, because I think that is, as I mentioned earlier, the elephant in the room, where a lot of that is kind of internalised by people. It kind of hasn't helped, I think, and it maybe kind of explains why we've got some of the problems that we've got at the present moment. So there could be a mayoral campaign against ageism. There could be a mayoral campaign about the benefits of older workers to workforces and London's economy. And other cities are doing it. I mean, Manchester has got an employers' toolkit, on how do you stimulate sort of age-friendly employment. Wales is doing a similar thing, but we haven't quite had that in London, and it may be because other issues, intersectional issues, are looked at as perhaps more important. But I think that this problem of older workers has been brewing for actually a number of years, and WiseAge, amongst other organisations, argued that the London Recovery Board should have a mission on older people. Now, the argument was that that wasn't, just as there was one for younger people, that wasn't kind of taken through. The idea was that issues around older people would be cross-cutting right across different missions. But I think we've missed an opportunity to tackle some of the problems that are for London older workers.
Yeah, I guess the downside of putting it everywhere is that it ends up nowhere, isn't it? Luke, did you want to add something on the labour market question?
Yes, I guess, the Greater Manchester thing that you referred to, we worked with them on that, and some of it at least is based on work we've done, research work over the last 6-7 years, looking at kind of what can employers do to make their kind of offer more age-friendly. And so it's based on these kind of 5 ideas, some of which actually overlap with the Good Work Charter that I know that London has, but the five broad areas that employers could do more on. There's hiring age positively, which includes hiring flexibly. So saying, we offer flexible working, which is a really appealing thing for older workers. So those employers that are struggling to attract people that want work, part of the gap there is the fact that a lot of older workers want flexible working, and they don't necessarily see that in job ads, but there's lots of other stuff about debiasing your language. There's stuff around creating an age-friendly culture, so making sure that people of all ages feel included in the workplace, being flexible about flexible working, so offering flexible working opportunities, having clear policies that are actually implemented, and understanding that it should be reason neutral. We sometimes see, it's fine to do flexible working if you've got kids, but if you're looking after another family member who's not a kid, maybe that's not, there's sometimes a bit of judgment around reasons, and actually that shouldn't be the case. Encouraging career development at all ages. Some older workers just want to continue a job until they retire, but many actually, have aspirations to progress and learn new things and do different things, and that should be enabled. And also ensuring everyone has the health support they need. So this is a huge range of things, including, sort of reasonable adjustments, which I think has been mentioned already, but access to occupational health, which of course is easier amongst large employers than it is amongst small employers, but there are ways that it can be done. And I think Tim's point around a campaign and the mayor using kind of their ability to do that could be really important. The other thing that we've started as an organisation we launched last year is our age-friendly employer pledge. So this is an opportunity for employers to sign up. They have a named lead. They commit to one action from the framework that I've just set out across the Age-Friendly 5 to do each year. So a thing they're going to do to improve their employment practice and commit to, making sure that age is in diversity and inclusion statements and all that kind of stuff. So, one thing that London could do, the GLA itself could sign up to the Age-Friendly Employer Pledge. We do have some central government departments that have signed up, but also they could, it could be something that is promoted to London employers as this is a way for you to think about how age-friendly your current employment practice is and how you could improve it. I think we're around 100-ish employers signed up at the moment, so it's growing, but we only launched it 4 or 5 months ago. So that's a really important thing that employers can do on the demand side. I think there's a lot of stuff that can be done on the supply side. So employment support services could do much better. Particularly, as I said, we've developed a range of kind of employment support principles from, again, the past 6-7 years worth of research, working with localities, places such as Greater Manchester, also in the West Midlands and other places too. And I can submit written detail to this point because it could take quite a long time to talk about, but there's a whole host of things around making sure support's tailored. It's about confidence, it's about transferable skills, it's about health, it's about care and responsibilities, making sure it's place-based, which I think London is well placed to do, of course. Trusted organisations delivering things, reducing fragmentation, having a clear gateway. There's a lot of research that shows that older people Not many are actually engaged with traditional employment support services, partly because they're not necessarily engaged in the working age benefit system. But there's also a lot of distrust and the idea that it's not for them. Maybe they see it as for younger workers, and therefore this kind of marketing to them as specifically 50 plus offer is really important, and setting targets for actual providers to deliver outcomes for these groups is also really important. As I said, there's a whole host of more details sitting under that I'd be more than happy to submit outside of this meeting.
Okay, I'm conscious we've strayed into questions actually that my colleagues wanted to ask, so thank you very much for your very comprehensive answer. I think we'll return to this topic in just a moment. This is my way of apologising to Abby, who I suspect is itching to come in, but my colleagues who are itching for me to pass the baton over, so I'll pass the baton over, and thank you very much. Thank you for your comprehensive answers.
Thank you. Assembly Member Polanski is actually scheduled to ask the next question, but I'm just very conscious of time that we are overrunning. Abigail, if there is anything that you want to add in terms of this particular area on older women and ethnic minorities, do let us know, perhaps in writing if you wish. As we do, we need to move on to the next section. But we also need to have a very quick break, and so I'll just do that very quickly, if that's okay, for 5 minutes. So thank you so much for the discussion so far, and we'll start our second set of questions just after the short adjournment. Welcome back to the Economy Committee meeting, where we will now move on to our second set of questions on financial security and employment opportunities for older Londoners. And we're going to be starting with Assembly Member Shane.
Oh, thank you. Have we moved past Assembly Member Polanski's question? Okay, fantastic. Well, good afternoon, good morning to the panel. Morning. It's been really fantastic and interesting to hear from everyone. And I think, as sort of Chair alluded to, the next question has sort of been covered. So it'd be good just to pull together the threads, if that's all right, from the panel. But I wanted to ask what the most significant long-term barriers to older Londoners accessing work are, and specifically how there are different demographic groups are disproportionately affected by these barriers. So I'm not sure who wants to start. It's really a question for everyone. Perhaps we can start with Tim, who's with us in person, and then those on screen can indicate if they want to come in with a hand.
So I think the barriers are, for the future, are about what I alluded to earlier, which was we needed kind of different conversation about work when you are sort of 50 or beyond, and I think it's important that that debate is happening across business. It's happening with people who are in that age group who in themselves need to be making the right informed choices. I think that's a really important issue, that a lot of people don't make the right choices when it comes to retirement or whatever. So I think there are some issues there about the right employment support for those who are out of the labour market. I think there are some issues around how you best, as Luke was talking earlier, about how you get the best age-friendly environment in organisations. But I think that the problem of treating older workers as a kind of one group is that, as we've discussed so far, is that there are groups who are very vulnerable. And I mean, clearly, there's ethnicity as an issue that needs to be dealt with in terms of employment. There's gender as well. That's a really big issue which hasn't really been adequately tackled. And a lot of that kind of support does need to be tailored for those who are looking for work, but also those who are in employment as well. I mean, that's I think one of the issues which isn't really discussed is about how you can best develop the right sort of ability for people to be able to have the best choice when they get to a certain age in terms of their work without barriers. And it's about reducing the barriers that's the key thing. I mean, all of that requires a kind of mapping the different needs of older workers and trying to look at what the solutions are by way of the right targeting. And therefore, there are, I mean, certainly the work that Wise Age does in terms of its employment support that it does tends to be more employment support, but it's also about holistic. So it's about it's about advice on financial well-being. It's about advice on navigating around the sort of health system and things like that. And I think that probably more of that kind of holistic support is something that ought to be developed. And it probably has to be done through organisations that are trusted and kind of have got a degree of empathy with older workers. I think your busy work coach in a job centre might have the right attitude, but they won't necessarily have the time to be able to commit to tackling some of the sort of individual problems that exist. So I think it's a big agenda, and I think one of the questions is whether across London we have that kind of strategy in place that can kind of address the needs and actually ensure that there is the right kind of solutions out there.
Brilliant, thank you, Tim. And I don't know if anyone else online wanted to contribute. I mean, I think just to particularly highlight the question around disproportionate barriers faced by different demographic groups, it would be great to tease that out a little bit more. I know Tim mentioned both ethnicity, but also that the gender gap in older Londoners hasn't really been dealt with in terms of a specific strategy. So I wondered if any of the other panellists also wanted to comment on whether they agreed with that and why.
Assemblymember Sheikh, Sonia Khan has a hand up. I'm not sure if you can necessarily see that on the Zoom.
I can't. Thank you, Zach. That's really helpful. Sonia, did you want to come in?
Thank you. Thanks, Zach. Yeah, the information that I'm going to share is from the work we've done on the Ageing Well strategy, and also looking at employability. We recently have started work bringing residents, DWP, health partners, voluntary and community sector and council partners together. So we've got some quite rich data about the barriers, and I will cover the intersectionality point as well. So I think, as Tim has said, the barriers really need to be mapped properly. It's not one barrier that we're talking about. It will depend on the job market and also the circumstances of people. But I think, just to summarise, the first thing is that when you get older, the stakes can be higher. You can have more commitments financially, you can have more dependents as well. And so it has to be good work, really, and safe and secure work with good working hours and conditions, supportive management that can maybe bring in reasonable adjustments, and also opportunities for people to develop if they've missed out on the sorts of skills that younger workers might have. It has to make economic sense. So that's the first point, is that it is a different thing that you need when you're older in terms of what makes employment plausible. The second is health concerns, and we heard in this session that we ran from occupational health colleagues who are working with people on an innovative programme to try and keep people in work. They reported that older people were more likely to have COVID-related conditions, that also there is well reported the difficulty of continuing to do manual work as you age. So there's a health condition example there, there's an example of the workplace. But when it comes to what employers can do, there were a number of things that those OTs were doing to try and help people stay in work. So in some cases, make the workplace itself less of a stressor. In other cases, it was that there was almost too much of a focus on the person's age and physical condition, and conversely, that sometimes the condition was ignored. So I think what this shows is that different employer interventions can actually cause more difficulty if they're not based on what somebody actually needs, and what an assessment has identified is the adjustment that's needed. The third area is about skills, and people not having the skills as the world of work changes to stay in work, or struggling to retrain or change careers. As people do get older, they may want to have more flexible working options, and so there may not be a good match between that and the opportunities available. Ageism, which has already been talked about, is a feeling and also an experience. But you know, as the population ages, older people can be an asset. We'll talk about this more in terms of what could be done nationally, regionally, and locally. And then your point about intersectionality. It's important to recognise that the links to poorer health. So people in lower socioeconomic groups more likely to have health conditions. People from certain ethnic backgrounds are more likely to have health conditions, and to have those health conditions undiagnosed. That will affect people's ability to work. So there's a clear link between socioeconomics and ethnicity. Older people, as people age, they have more caring responsibilities. They may be that sandwich generation as well, who are caring for younger people, children, and also older people. Somebody in their 50s is a case, an example. And so there's that recognition that then it goes back to what I was saying about flexibility. And nationally, we've talked about disability itself. So nationally, we know, and it's the same in Hackney, that proportion of disabled people increases with age, linked often to health conditions. And so it's important to look at to look at one group that are struggling to get back into the workplace where disability or health condition is a factor, and it's important to be that intersectional. The OT, the evidence from the OT was talking about a 40-60 split between people with mental health difficulties and physical health difficulties, who they were seeing in that caseload. And I just can share, following this meeting, some of the research that demonstrates that the same inequalities that people face when they're younger compound as they get older. So there's the Centre for Better Ageing have got evidence cards that show that those inequalities are exacerbated as people age. Equity effect report showed that age discrimination is likely to be compounded. And there's going back to the question about pensions, there's an Institute Fiscal, the IFS report. IFS have published a report that shows pensions and the gender pay gap. And then going back to the trends, if people are leaving the workplace because of, let's say, the rising cost of childcare, and that's women, then their pensions may be lower. And so state pensions are actually equal, but private pensions, there is a growing gap, and I'll send that report as part of the evidence.
Sonia, that was really substantial and very helpful. Thank you. And it kind of flows quite naturally into the next question, which I might just move us on to for the sake of flow. But, you talked obviously about health being a really key barrier and also disability. So I wondered what actions you think can be taken to increase participation of disabled older Londoners and older Londoners with ill health in the workplace, including by employers, and also obviously City Hall and government.
Yeah, so this was also part of why we brought people together, was to look at what we can now take forward locally, and also what we would like to see nationally. So I'll briefly summarise that. So the first thing to say is that there is work going on within the council on a discretionary basis that supports people into work, and apprenticeships are for all ages. But it's very clear from the work that we've done that we need to collaborate with others to tailor something that is geared to over 50s. So during the pandemic, we launched a 16+ network that was focused on how we collaborate with partners to get young people into work. So we need something similar. We need something that focuses on over 50s and brings people together. We have met with the DWP, and they were also part of the scoping meeting that we had. They have a 50+ champion who works across the East London geography, but as has been said already, work coaches aren't necessarily able to give the time to tailor support to this age group and address the barriers that I've gone through. But they are already working with employers and targeting certain employers and looking at how they can become age friendly. And they're also doing labour market analysis to look at employer demand, where there are gaps in the labour market and where there's a skills gap. And they're testing at the moment through some flexible support funds work specifically focused on well-being, and so it's early days, but what we want to now do is build on the work that's already being resourced through DWP and come up with something that's more holistic and tailored. So we are, the recommendations that we're working through at the moment are about how we bend programmes that are focused on health, like social prescribing, community navigators, to actually be able to collaborate and develop more of an employment-focused offer. We need to make sure that we are working with the whole person. Old people represent the full diversity of London, of Hackney, and it's really important to say, and we found this during the Ageing Well strategy, that whilst our focus is on over 50s, that doesn't, there is a huge diversity in people who are over 50 in terms of their ageing process. Some people are facing a lot of challenges. Others, and this is linked often to socioeconomics, are not at all and not seeing themselves as old or older. So we need to recognise that you know, there are multiple challenges, but we need to focus on where the challenges are most compounded and look at joined up approaches to health that look at health skills, confidence building, and also recognise those things that I talked about that are to do with responsibilities outside of work and more flexibility. So this also needs to be linked to a focus on economic inclusion. So collaborating with debt and benefit advisors and linking that to return to work support. So that is, we are now developing, we are now looking at how we could bring all of that together and actually pilot work that is holistic, that has an offer, that looks at the whole person, as I say, that has those elements in it. The next thing to say is to recognise that the world of work has changed at pace. It's changed even more during the pandemic. So that careers advice needs to not just be generic careers advice, but geared to somebody who may have been in a role for a long time and needs to understand how recruitment has changed and how the labour market's changed. We cannot assume that somebody who has been in work most of their working life is necessarily able to find work when they leave a workplace or lose a job, because they may have lost those skills around actually selling themselves and putting themselves in the best position in a job market that is likely to have some ageism linked, you know, attached to it as well. And that then brings me on to something that we also want to look at, which is about social capital networks. In the same way that young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds may not have the links that are really helpful to expose them to the world of work, to understand the diversity of jobs, that may be the same for older people. So how do we make sure, especially if you've been in one career for a long time, that you've got those networks and links around you? And I just wanted to flag that we've recently received funding through the GLA around community engagement, and that's focused on ethnographic work that really unpacks people's perception of employment opportunity and what the barriers are. And so that will also be a key strand that we'll want to look at. So we're going to bring people back together at the end of April, including residents, to start to map gap and develop the new solutions that are based on the issues I've just identified. I can go on and talk about national and regional actions needed, but I just wanted to pause there and check that this is the right point to do that.
Well, that was super, super helpful. And yes, I think absolutely it'd be great to hear you draw on regional and national. And I think to that, I wanted to ask something, add an extra dimension to that, if it's all right. It's obviously you've spoken a lot about sort of 50 plus and those maybe sort of within the workforce, if they've taken sort of some temporary time out or you know, generally rebuilt, like continuing their career. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about those who, for instance, have retired and the kind of drive from national government to encourage those in retirement to come back into the workforce, and whether, for instance, like the shorter apprenticeships are the best way for that to encourage that kind of work. So yeah, if you could just comment on that a little bit as well, please, Sonia.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll touch on that at the end. It's a great question. So I think that the first thing to say about the national picture is that this isn't, because of the barriers and the responsibilities that I've described, an approach is needed that isn't just about caseworkers supporting people to get off benefits and find any work, because an older person who then moves into unsuitable work might need to change quite quickly. The impacts might may do more harm. So it does need to be focused on getting people into good work rather than any work. Linked to that, we've already talked about employer engagement. So the idea of having toolkits is great, but something needs, there needs to be some drive behind that to incentivize employers to take up those toolkits and to think about employing people. And there needs to be some buzz, some actual excitement about this, about the fact that there is such a pool of people who could offer so much and actually just change perception about what it is to be an older person, somebody over 50 up to 65, 70 in the workplace, the sort of experience and life experience and work experience that means that often people are less, they're more unflappable about issues that come up. So there needs to be some real shifting of the perception here. And this is, of course, a national, priority, because of productivity. We have labour market gaps. We have to find ways to get more people into work. This will be a budget theme. It will continue to be a theme for the next 18 months and beyond. And so focusing on older people back into the workplace is not just about individual benefit, it's about how we actually have an economy that is able to be productive, because employers are not always chasing their tail to fill vacancies, and employer groups have talked a lot about this. So then the question is, well, if you're raising this as a key risk to productivity, what can we do to look at older people? And then there's something about job retention for older people. So when we heard the lived experience of people, it's going through restructures, for example, being in line for redundancy. There's just, again, some national thinking and some regional thinking about what we could do to make sure that older people are seen as a group who are more vulnerable at a time of restructure, and what could be done there. I know beyond the scope of the GLA, but looking at the benefit system, there's Integration Hub, Central London Forward, which is focused on disabled Londoners. But again, making that link to disability, we're interested in how we link those. In terms of getting a retired workforce back into work, again, that links to what I was saying about labour market shortages. I think that a lot of the barriers that I've described will be similar. But what I would say is that perhaps we should be looking at what can be done to retain people or get people into the workplace and keep people before retirement age. So I appreciate that we're in a skills shortage. That means that there has to be some strategies to get retired people back into the workplace, you know, who are over 65. And I think that the barriers that I've described, some of them are going to be the same. But actually a longer term approach would be to try to keep people in the workplace and look at where there are labour market shortages. So I know there's work going on, for example, with nurseries to look at childcare and that targeted approach. So again, regionally and nationally, there's the sectoral skills analysis that might be able to identify the areas where an older workforce would be really suitable and well placed with good experience, life experience, work experience to come back and be matched to those sorts of sectors. That hopefully will give quite a secure income as well, because we've talked about pensions. You know, people are getting into their 50s and they've got a 15-year, they haven't been making pension contributions. Actually, having 15 years to be able to make some pension contributions, that becomes more and more important.
Thank you very much, Sonia. That was very helpful. I don't know if anyone else from the panel wanted to comment. Otherwise, I was going to move us on to the point around digital exclusion.
Can I just make one comment about? I mean, I think Sonia's right that there's sort of a need for incentivising employers, and there's something about your words using a buzz and to sort of give the message that older workers aren't a kind of a threat to the system, but they are actually a valuable component of that. I think that's all important. There's also something about how do you monitor what's happening in the labour market. And I mean, one issue I would raise is we need age reporting for employees. I think that is quite important. It is, I mean, for example, I was looking at what the GLA's over 60s rate was, and it's 4.3%. Hackney's evidently is 13%. You know, is there a reason behind that? And also your 4.3%, 2% of only 2% have got employment services of less than a year, which means that actually you're not recruiting many over 60s, which so I think that there needs to be more age reporting and debate about some of those issues, as well as on age-friendly employment. I fully support, you know, the idea of having pledges and standards, but there is something about you almost need a witch guide to what is the flexibility that's offered by employers, what's the systems of support they have, because it's kind of increasing the overall kind of standards of handling older workers that I think is really important.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, I know we've discussed digital exclusion a little bit, but I wanted to ask about it in the context of, the ability for Londoners to access employment. I know we previously talked about it in the context of financial insecurity. So I think I've got maybe Theo or Tim, if you wanted to comment on this. Maybe Theo, I'll start from you because I think we haven't heard from you for a little while. But yeah, what impact does digital exclusion have on older Londoners' ability to access employment?
I think it will have quite a profound effect and an increasing effect these days. The ability to search for jobs, the ability to work if you've got to use a laptop, or your familiarization with how basic programs work, to type things and so on. So I think increasingly work is digitized, so it is a requirement almost in many jobs. So we therefore have set out quite a big program on how to ensure that those barriers to work are minimized. Now, one of the challenges that there has been with digital inclusion, and I've worked in this field for a number of years. I've worked with Martha Lane Fox at Race Online. I was also a counsellor in Camden when UK online centres were being rolled out in libraries. So free computers were being put in libraries. And one of the challenges with digital exclusion, as we found with the work done by the London Office of Technology and Innovation, is there are many, many initiatives, whether they're corporate or neighbourhood charity or council across London, and often they help a particular digital exclusion need rather than providing a triage process. So someone could lack basic digital skills, or they could lack some data or a affordable connection, or they could lack a suitable device, or they could need some other kind of support. And whilst we have these many, many initiatives, over 100 at least in London, doing some really, really sort of heroic work on the ground, the ability to triage that need as a whole is limited, which is why we've teamed up with London Office of Technology and Innovation, so the London Boroughs, and the Good Things Foundation, to provide that kind of pathway, if you like, a no wrong door, so that need can be triaged.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm tempted to move on to Assemblymember Polanski because I feel like this has been covered now. So over to you, Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you very much. Just on housekeeping, there's been a few things in the chat. Sorry, I lost my mute button there. I'm still not used to Zoom.
Yeah, I think we can carry on with you, Assemblymember Polanski. It's fine.
Fantastic. Abby mentioned that Age UK London's already signed up as an age-friendly employer, and it's a great scheme. I just thought to say that out loud for the transcript. Theo, if I can come back to you, what actions have been taken through the Digital Access for All recovery mission to address digital exclusion for older Londoners, and what impact has this work been?
Thank you for that question. So I set out the Get Online London service, which is now live. So there is now a network of, I think, around 350 or 400 neighbourhood hubs that are part of the Good Things Foundation network that are that offer a sort of combined digital inclusion service to Londoners. They offer a skills package which is linked to basic skills level 1 called Learn My Way. They offer access to a national data bank which provides people who can't afford SIM cards with a SIM card, so a limited amount of data so you can get online. And also they flag post the social tariffs that Abby talked about. And thirdly, which is a kind of new play in this field, they offer access to a refurbished laptop. And so the Digital Access for All mission, Get Online London, is in the process of securing end of business life laptops and other kits from public bodies, from businesses, so that they can be refurbished through Good Things Foundation and given or lent to people in their locality. So this is a business model that is developing, which we aim towards that it will be sustainable, and it's already distributed around 900 devices to Londoners. And in terms of older people, about half of the neighbourhood hubs, although we don't have precise stats on like how many older people have benefited from this, half of those 350 hubs that I identified before said that, or self-declared as supporting older people as one of their user groups. So I would say, you know, about a half of the devices that we've distributed already have gone to those hubs, which have said that they are helping older people amongst their user groups.
This is really wonderful to hear. As chair of the Environment Committee, we did a report last year into waste, and particularly around electronics. So that's really good to hear. In terms of metrics, so you said that you've done 900, and obviously that's impressive, and it's always easy for someone to wade in and go, why not more? How scalable is this, and how quickly are you looking to scale it?
I mean, it's 900 in the first couple of months. So right. So this is kind of, you know, early year one. So we are, I mean, our target is to reach 75,000 Londoners, not 750,000. 75,000 Londoners in the first 2 years. But that would be their needs either with a device or basic skills or the data package. I should say that there are other interventions which have an impact or could have a real impact on Londoners. So the Connected London programme, it's the one that's putting full fibre across the city, is linking up to about 700 public buildings. So that's libraries, community centres, youth clubs, and ensuring that they have access to gigabit capable internet speeds. So that means that if someone had a device, they could walk into one of these places and log on and effectively get free high-speed Wi-Fi from that. And of course, it helps those public bodies because they can provide all sorts of other services to people that require that kind of connection. That's happening now. A couple of hundred buildings have been hooked up already, but the target there is over 700 in the next 2 years. And a really, really interesting model is being developed by Westminster, which also addresses data poverty. And that is by adopting a standard called Open Roam, which is a sort of unified way of logging on to a free Wi-Fi network. So you only have to log on once with your credentials, and then you can kind of walk around and link to all of the places that have adopted that standard. So that, I think, reduces a barrier for digital exclusion. So someone doesn't have to walk down the street and log on about 10 times, you know, depending on where they're going. And so we want to see we're currently investigating with them how this standard can be adopted more broadly across London, which of course has attendant economic benefits. I mean, imagine if all street markets had the same log on for Wi-Fi or museums, etc. So it sort of goes to show that actually some of our interventions here, whilst really, really helping digitally excluded people, also are a part of just being generally helpful to Londoners and the economy as a whole.
For sure. And so just to bounce off that a little bit, Sonia spoke really powerfully, I thought, before around intersectionality and particularly around women in society and ethnic minorities, and all through the lens of older people where those effects are disproportionately impacted. Around making sure that these groups have access to these sort of initiatives, what work is being done to reach people who may be from these communities?
This is a really, really important point. And the kind of distinction that I would make with the Get Online London service is it's treating digital exclusion or digital inclusion as a service. So it's using a service design methodology that we see in other areas that identifies user need. So we've done this work on the personas. So we've unpicked the complexity of this big puzzle of digital exclusion and talks directly to that user. That information is able then to flow through and modify and change the service as it goes on. And that is different from perhaps the previous approaches to digital exclusion, which was a little bit more top down. It was sort of saying 70% of this group or 43% of that group are digitally excluded. Here is what they need. And the sort of feedback loop, if you like, is much more limited. So by concentrating on that user need, we should be able to get, first of all, to really talk to individuals rather than see them as cohorts of people, have a better idea of numbers and a better iteration of the service over time. And that should make it, I think, more sustainable, more effective, more successful for Londoners. So we're really, really pleased that, in a sense, we've had a kind of mindset shift away from masses of projects, more to the idea of digital inclusion as a service.
Right. And just finally from me, in the chat, you've popped in some links around the London Office of Technology. I don't know if you want to speak more about what those links are and the work the Mayor's doing, or if it's been covered.
Assemblymember Polanski, we can't hear you. Just give her a second if we can sort that out.
Just been asked about the links that I put in the chat. Do you want me to respond and I'll ask the question and answer it?
I think they've lost us in the chamber, so I think maybe we just...
So, Assemblymember Polanski, we still can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
All right, okay. Hold on just one moment.
Yes.
I mean, if any Assembly member wants to carry on his behalf, or I'll just do it myself.
Which number is he on?
On 16.
Has he already asked the question?
No.
Hello, panel. I'll just pick up where my colleague has left off with these digital issues. How is the Mayor working with the London Office of Technology and Innovation to develop the digital inclusion initiatives in London, and what is the impact of this work had on other Londoners? Let me start with our GLA member of staff there and go from there.
Thank you for that question.
Oh, I can't hear you now as well.
You can't. Okay, so we can't be heard.
Right. Hold on a moment, please. Okay, so what we're going to do is actually see if we can ask that question to Tim, because he is in the chamber right now, and then we'll go back to Theo if we can.
Tim?
Okay.
I probably don't know enough about it, actually.
I did think that'd be a problem. Theo, are you with us? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Do you remember the question, or shall I repeat it?
I do remember the question.
Great,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, that's fantastic. It actually dovetails with Zach's question. So what I've just set out with the Get Online London service, Get Online London was commissioned by Lottie to meet which is the London Office of Technology and Innovation, to meet the recovery mission challenge. So the Mayor of London is effectively providing funding for this unified service in London for the first time. Year one was doing sort of new forms of research to understand the nature of the problem. Why was that? Because the pandemic showed us that digital exclusion was far more nuanced and, in a sense, widespread than we had previously thought. And the kind of drift of digital exclusion policy was more towards sort of making websites more usable rather than kind of realizing that people couldn't afford a connection, didn't have a device, or really didn't have those basic skills. So Lottie's work, year one, as I put in the chat, and this will be distributed to Assembly members, did some geographical mapping. So that's taking the really good practice of what happened in Westminster and Brent, see where the concentrations of that digital exclusion was, and created a way in which all boroughs could use that same process. And secondly, to do that work around personas. So rather than seeing older people as a whole, one homogenous mass, saying actually there are different kinds of digital exclusion here. And that took us to the point where we had a partnership conversation with Good Things Foundation. And effectively we are funding the Good Things Foundation to provide this unified approach. So in effect, the Mayor's funding is working with London boroughs, which is then working with a major civil society organisation to provide a unified digital inclusion service for London.
Thank you for that. Firstly, can I just say Lottie is my favourite acronym I've ever heard. I absolutely love that. I'm going to move you on slightly to focus on individuals here. So how many older Londoners have benefited from the essential digital skills entitlement and other digital skills programmes delivered through the adult education budget? And what impact has this had on their employment prospects? Because ultimately we want people to move on. So where's the impact been as well?
So I thank you for that question. The Essential Digital Skills Entitlement is, of course, a really, really big part of our programme. About 5,000 people, I believe, and if I'm wrong, I'll correct that information on the record, but around 5,000 people have benefited from the free digital skills courses that are provided by neighbourhood colleges. And about a quarter of that, so just over 1,000 people, will be in the over 50 category. So this provides people with those kind of essential skills that the government sets out that people need to just be online. So it's a start. And as I see, and so the challenge for us is like, how do we get more people onto these courses? And I think there's a real role for Get Online London, the service that we're doing with Good Things Foundation, to link up with colleges and to use their network of trusted neighbourhood centres to really reach more and more excluded groups. So progress, but I think more can be done, because let's remember that the wider figure of digital exclusion in London is probably about 8,000 or 9,000 people per borough who don't have, these basic skills. Maybe more, maybe less. So still some way to go.
Thank you. And this is a question to everybody. Just, you might want to chip in. Do we think that the lack of digital skills is just generational? So as we naturally go through, it'll improve, or is it something to do with aging? You just, no matter what your level of interaction with digital, it stops as you start to get older, it reduces. Is it just generational? Let me start with Tim, because Tim looked perturbed at that.
No. I was thinking that I think it's quite difficult to define that. I mean, there's something about access to new technology and new forms of social media and that sort of thing, which will be to a certain extent generational. But it probably, I'd rephrase slightly the question by saying, well, how do we try and ensure that actually you don't get that dissonance between different generations? Mm-hmm. You reduce it, and I think there are ways of doing it. But I think there is a danger of assuming that all older people aren't able to use social media, aren't able to use Zoom and that sort of thing, which isn't the case. And I think that therefore I think it is important to be able to make sure that different generations do kind of have access and equipped to be able to handle the sort of latest forms.
Okay. Would anybody else like to make a comment? Abigail?
Can I come in?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So I think it's worth bearing in mind that sometimes there is a change in people's internet use throughout their life. So there's some data that HK London published in 2021 looking at whether people had used the internet more or less or about the same since the start of the pandemic. And it was particularly interesting to look at amongst those over the age of 75, 20% said they started using the internet more, which sort of tied in with expectations of, for some people who were in the situation, kind of had the resources. The pandemic was a bit of a prompt to go online more, but 10% said that they'd started using it less. And when we were speaking to other people in a bit more detail, following up on that research, one of the things we picked up was this ties into the idea that you can have confidence in some aspects of using the internet, but not in others. So perhaps using some systems at work that you've been trained to use, fine and straightforward. Quite often people are reasonably confident using things like sort of email or social media sites that they used to stay in touch with friends, but not confident at all when it comes to things like putting your bank details into a website. And one of the things that particularly jumped out when we were doing this research a couple of years ago was a few people coming to us and saying they had used the internet previously when they had been in work, partly because there was training or support, there were other people around there that made them feel confident using it, but now they was retired and didn't have access to that. They weren't really using the internet for anything in their personal life, and they had lost confidence in that regard. I think that's probably not the experience for everyone, but it is worth bearing in mind there are some people who will previously use the internet a bit more and will use it less throughout their life.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap up the meeting with a crucial question, and something that essentially we really need to pull out from our discussion today, which are clear recommendations of how we can improve the lives of older Londoners. So what further action would you like to see the Mayor take to support older Londoners into work and improve their living standards? And Tim, I want to start with you because you made some really good points about the need to recognise age discrimination and ageism, and having a campaign explicitly run by the Mayor on this, similar to what we've seen in Wales, and you talked about a toolkit in Manchester. Have you got anything else to add?
Only that I think it's important how the GLA looks at this issue across its directorates, and also staff understanding of some of these issues as well, which is quite important. And my slight worry is that we and other organisations, including Abby, have been involved in developing age-friendly action plan for London, which is part of its commitment to being an age-friendly city. And that's got a raft of very good proposed initiatives, which to a certain extent are addressed through existing GLA initiatives. So it's kind of saying, you know, we've got this initiative, Good Work Standard, and it will cater for older workers by way of getting employers to be more age friendly. It doesn't necessarily create bespoke solutions to the problems, and I think that that's one difficulty. And the second difficulty is this issue about if you don't measure it, then you don't necessarily know how things are improving. And I think that lack of measurement is really important. So I'd make those 2 points, as well as the point I made earlier, which is the soft power of the Mayor in terms of Sonia, I think, said, creating a buzz about older workers and actually raising the issues so we've got a better debate across London.
And I appreciate that. And again, that theme of how when they're not a homogenous group, they're all different. They're the different requirements. I think everyone's mentioned that at some point. Abigail, do you have anything that you'd like to see in terms of further action?
I'd absolutely support what Tim said about thinking about age right across every aspect of the work. There's also 3 other areas where I think it'll be good to see more activity. One is the fact that we need more data, we need more research in this area of how poverty affects older Londoners. Poverty is greater here, it's different, and I think there's something the GLA can do in terms of the data sets that we already put out are very helpful. More and more nuanced data in that area so that we can really understand what's going on will be incredibly helpful. The next thing that I'm going to say, which is no surprise to anyone, is when budgets allow reinstating free travel for old Londoners before 9 AM, but you've all heard me say that many, many times before. And the final one, and this also comes with an offer of working with Age Care London, if this would be helpful, is picking up on the point I made about thinking more creatively about how can we genuinely encourage uptake of pension credit, what different methods can we try out to try and boost that uptake level a little bit higher than 80%? And I'd be very happy to work with anyone who wants to look at that.
Absolutely, and I'm sure there's lots of Assembly members here who'll be willing to put in those extra questions in about data as well. Thank you. And Luke?
Yeah, I think I'd echo what others have said, and at the risk of repeating myself, I think that campaign is a really good idea. We're currently developing a campaign against ageism at a national level at Centre for Ageing Better. I'm sure we'd be happy to talk to anyone who would be interested in thinking about a London-specific one around the benefits and opportunities of an older workforce. I think the employer pledge that I mentioned is really important. The GLA thinking about how it itself operates in terms of age inclusivity, but leveraging its employer relationships with others to get them to think about it. And part of that is getting employers to measure and report on age-related issues in their workplace, which I think someone else mentioned earlier. And then in terms of employment support, making sure that there is targeting and marketing to older people. And by targeting, I mean that measurement point that someone else has mentioned, and making sure that people are actually employment support providers are actually thinking about older people specifically in the context of their provision. We've also, in our working in Greater Manchester, developed kind of a pilot approach to an employment support service that we think would particularly reach those who are economically inactive, and we're hoping to test it out in a bit more detail in Greater Manchester over the coming years. But that's something that maybe London could think about exploring. Obviously that all depends on funding and other things, but there are a model based on those principles that we think would be quite effective. So yeah, that's it from me.
It's great to see Manchester being mentioned quite a few times there, so thank you so much. There's a lot of good examples of work there. And moving on to the last contributor, Sonia.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the first thing to say is that there does need to be a vision around this, around why this matters, linked to being an age-friendly city, but bringing it into the big issues that London faces and showing that being age-friendly also helps us tackle those big issues. And two of the big issues that are also going to be big national issues are the skills shortage that employers face and the risks to productivity, risks to productivity. And the other big issue is health and social care and pressures, and how through being age-friendly and keeping people in work, we might be able to tackle the health and social care crisis in terms of demand, but also in terms of labour market and the gaps in labour market. And I just wanted to make one point that I didn't make earlier, which is that if people are socio-economically disadvantaged and face difficulty during their working lives, that is likely to impact on how dependent they are, either on family or on the state financially, as an older person. It's an obvious thing to say, but it's worth just saying if you haven't been able to build up savings or pay into a pension and you're in private sector, and also the link between that and health conditions that may worsen. And so then people who need the most support are also the most dependent and the most vulnerable. So drawing those strands together and then being able to set out what's needed. And I've already talked about the asks for national and regional policy makers, so I won't go through those again, but I would identify the levers that the GLA has. So the levers over employers, which may be soft power, but we've worked closely with colleagues in the GLA around toolkits that encourage employers to think about young black men facing labour market disadvantage, seeing young black men as talent pool. So there's something similar about an approach that could be taken working with employers, going back to some of what I was saying earlier and Tim was saying. Travel, already mentioned freedom passes, but actually just the point of buses supporting an age-friendly city and the importance as you get older. I've given separate evidence to a local scrutiny commission about that, and I'll share that, I'll follow up and share that afterwards. Civic participation, I mentioned that we've recently been able to access funding through the GLA for community engagement. Being able to see the link between ageing well, volunteering and civic participation, and make sure it's there in the work, and then poverty reduction as well, another area where we've worked closely with the GLA. We have a local set of slides that we share with the local voluntary and community sector about how they can help us to increase pension take-up, I will share that. But is that something that actually could be, developed as a London-wide resource?
Thank you. Thank you so much. And yes, all our guests are very welcome to add any extra comments if they wish in writing. We have now reached the end of the session. I would like to thank our guests who've attended in the chamber. Thank you so much, considering the challenges of today with the strikes, and everyone online. The committee has got a few more items of business to deal with, but you're very welcome just to stay for a moment, Tim, and then we'll be finished. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Agreed.
Great, and thank you. And this is my last meeting as chair of economy. I just want to say thank you so much. You have been a fantastic team. The assembly members here come from all parties, and we all work together to scrutinise the mayor, to make sure that we're being the voice of London. And it's been an absolute honour to do this job during a really difficult time, a cost of living crisis, and many challenges ahead for Londoners, but also on budget day. So let's see what whether the recommendations that we have any correlation to what the government will be doing today. But also I want to say a special thank you to the Secretariat who work behind the scenes. Tim, Jack, Martha, Emma, Lauren, Zoe, Ashley, all the people behind the scenes, the technical team, even when things go wrong slightly. Thank you very, very much for all your hard work. And it's been an absolute honour, as I said. The next meeting of the Economy Committee will be confirmed at the London Assembly annual meeting on the 4th of May 2023. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting.